Welcome back, everyone, to Behind the Arc Basketball. Last season, the SEC was dominated by Kentucky, which went 15-3 in the conference. Auburn finished tied for second with LSU in the SEC, as both teams were 3 games behind Big Blue Nation in the conference, going 12-6. In total, the SEC would have most likely gotten at least 4 NCAA tournament bids last season, with Kentucky, Auburn, LSU, and Florida, while Arkansas, Mississippi State, Tennessee, South Carolina, and Alabama were all fighting for bubble spots at the end of last season. This season, I expect the SEC to be much more competitive at the top of the conference, with some of their key players who withdrew from the NBA draft to head back to college. The SEC schedule for this season will consist of 18 conference games, which will start conference play in late December. In this video, I'm going to give a rundown of my Southeastern Conference college basketball rankings for the 2020-21 college basketball season. We'll start off here at number 14. The team that I predict that will finish last this season in the SEC happens to be the Vanderbilt Commodores. Vanderbilt has finished last in the SEC during the past 2 seasons. The Commodores only went 9-45 during their last 3 seasons in conference play. This season, I predict another bottom of the conference finish here for Vandy. In the offseason, the Commodores lost its top 2 scorers with Adam Nesmith and Saban Lee to the NBA draft. Lee averaged over 18 points per game last season, while Nesmith averaged 23 points per game. Vandy will have a ton of work this season to try to cut into that type of scoring production from their top 2 scorers. Heading back to Nashville will be a young roster with sophomore guard Scottie Pippen Jr., who's the son of Hall of Famer 6-time NBA champ Scottie Pippen. Also, Vanderbilt will get back their number 2 rebounder on the roster with last season with their forward Dylan Dessou. A third starter from last season will be back as well with senior guard Maxwell Evans, and also adding in a senior forward Cleavon Brown, who happened to be granted a medical redshirt season this year after playing in only 9 games last season. Brown averaged 6 rebounds per game last season for Vanderbilt. Head coach Jerry Stackhouse, he's also going to add in an impact transfer that should be able to start right away for the Commodores with junior guard DJ Harvey from Notre Dame. Harvey sat out last season due to transfer rules, but as a sophomore, he started 29 games for Notre Dame and averaged 10.7 points per game. The transfer for Harvey here, that sure helps Vandy out, but the future of the program, it lies in here, in the hands of the 2 sophomores, Scottie Pippen Jr. and Dylan Dessou. And if these 2 players can take the next step up and continue to improve here, that'll be huge towards the future for Vanderbilt. But I predict for this season, it's going to be a tough one to replace that offensive type-like production out of Nesmith and Lee that they had last season. And I predict that Vanderbilt will finish last once again here in the SEC. Now we'll move on to number 13. For my prediction, the SEC this season, that happens to be the Mississippi State Bulldogs, as Mississippi State lost their top 4 scorers, all of them double-digit scores that they lost in the offseason, and I expect that Mississippi State will take a big step down this season. Leaving the program to go to the NBA draft was leading scorer Reggie Perry, also Robert Woodard, also went to the NBA draft, as well as a third player with Nick Weatherspoon. This season, head coach Ben Howland will return only 2 starters, with guard DJ Stewart, who averaged 8.5 points per game during his freshman season, and 6'11" big man Abdul Adu, who led the Bulldogs with over 6 rebounds per game last season. Sophomore guard Iverson Molinar, he'll be back as well, which he started 8 games last season for the Bulldogs. In the offseason, Howland added an impact grad transfer with a guard, Jalen Johnson, who was the leading scorer last season for Louisiana Lafayette. He averaged 15.5 points per game, 6.6 rebounds per game last season for Louisiana Lafayette. As for the Bulldogs bench here for Mississippi State, that's where I predict that they're going to struggle, as they're going to have a ton of freshmen battling it out for minutes on the court. And one of those key freshmen, however, that I predict here that should be a starter in the team this season happens to be Davon Smith, who is a 4-star point guard coming up this season on the roster as a freshman. This season, though, I predict that Mississippi State's going to finish with a record under 500 overall. After 3 straight seasons here of 20 or more wins, the Bulldogs happen to lose their top 4 scorers from last season. That's a lot of production that they lost there from their top 4, all double-digit scores, by the way, from this past season, and I predict that that's going to be tough to make up for those roster losses right there, and I predict Mississippi State to finish 13th this season in the SEC. Now move on to number 12 here for my prediction, in the Southeastern Conference this season happens to be the Georgia Bulldogs. So Georgia last season was carried by this lone star, basically Anthony Edwards, who averaged over 19 points per game during his freshman season. He left for the NBA draft, where he is now a projected top 3 draft pick. Besides losing Anthony Edwards, Georgia lost 4 more players as well in the offseason. With their number 2 scorer, they lost Rayshawn Hammonds. He decided to head over to the NBA draft as well, along with other players lost, such as guards Tyree Crump, Jordan Harris, and Donald Gresham Jr., as all 3 of those players graduated from the program. For this season's roster, Georgia will bring back 2 starters with sophomores Severe Wheeler and Tomani Camara. The Bulldogs will also be bringing in 3 grad transfers this season as well. As I expect the grad transfer to step up this season happens to be PJ Horn that I predict here, who he started 30 games last season for the Virginia Tech Hokies. He averaged over 7 points per game for Virginia Tech. The second grad transfer happens to be a former guard from Stony Brook, Andrew Garcia, who averaged over 13 points per game and under 7 rebounds per game last season. And the third transfer is a guard with Justin Kier, who is a 3-year starter at George Mason. Battling for lineup spots for Georgia will also be 2 junior college transfers, with Tyron McMillan and Michael Starks. The Bulldogs will also be bringing in a 4-star point guard as well, with KD Johnson as a freshman. But just with so much turnover during the offseason with Georgia's roster, I predict here that the Bulldogs are going to struggle this season, and I predict that they're going to be at the bottom of the SEC, as I predict Georgia to finish 12th in the conference. Now we'll move on to number 11. The team that I predict that will finish 11th in the SEC this season happens to be the Texas A&M Aggies, as they had its first season under new head coach Buzz Williams back in the 2019-20 season. In Texas A&M, they finished with a winning record at 16-14, and they were 7th in the conference this past season. But this season, I expect the Aggies to take a step back in the conference due to Texas A&M losing its top scorer to graduation. Departing in the offseason was leading scorer Josh Nebo, and also Texas A&M's number 3 scorer left the program as well with Wendell Mitchell. As for the other players heading back to College Station this season, the Aggies will get back number 2 scorer, senior guard Savion Flagg, who averaged over 10 points per game and over 5 rebounds per game last season. Also coming back for the Aggies will be senior guard Quentin Jackson, and also their leading rebounder, sophomore forward Emmanuel Miller. He'll return as he led the Aggies last season as a freshman in rebounding. Also coming back to Texas A&M will be 2 more guards with J.J. Taylor and Andre Gordon. Also, Buzz Williams was able to get a great transfer pickup to help out on the boards this season with the nation's top rebounder in all college basketball last season, Kevin Marfo, who averaged 13.3 rebounds per game for Quinnipiac last season. And Marfo should be able to give the Aggies a much-needed boost on the boards, able to cut into some of that rebounded production lost from Nebo, who graduated from the roster. This season, though, I predict that Texas A&M is going to go backwards in the conference. I predict that they're going to finish 11th in the SEC. Now move on to number 10. My prediction for number 10 in the SEC this season happens to be the Auburn Tigers. So Auburn finished 2nd in the conference, tied with LSU last season. But in the offseason here, Auburn lost so much. They lost their entire starting 5. They lost their top 6 scorers left the program. So Auburn lost from their roster Samir Dowdy, Javon McCormick, Austin Wiley, D'Angelo Purifoy, and from Anthony McLemore. They lost all 5 of those players to graduation, and then they also lost Isaac Okoro, who decided to enter the NBA draft after his freshman season. So this season, Auburn is going to bring in one of the youngest rosters in all college basketball. Head coach Bruce Pearl will bring in a top 10 recruiting class this season. Heading into Auburn as a freshman will be 5-star freshman point guard Sharif Cooper. He is the player to watch out this season for the Tigers. Also a 4-star power forward with JT Thor, and a 4-star point guard with Justin Powell. Now, I expect Cooper and Thor to start right away, right off the bat for Auburn this season. As for more players returning back to Auburn, these players have very little experience. They were part of last season's roster, and they should be able to see a significant increase in minutes for the Tigers. Heading back to Auburn will be guards Devin Cambridge, Jamal Johnson, and Alan Flanagan. All 3 of these players averaged anywhere between 11 to 14 minutes last season, and all 3 of these players averaged less than 5 points per game. So All three of these players indeed should be able to see a significant uptick in minutes as well as improvement this season on the court for the Tigers. They have a really young team this season for Auburn, and I predict that this team is going to have a down season for Auburn since Pearl will bring in a ton of freshmen onto the roster here. I would honestly be shocked if Auburn made it into the NCAA tournament in 2021 with all these youngsters on the roster. But if Auburn retains the majority of these players in the offseason, and if these players can improve throughout the course of the season, then once again, I expect Auburn to be back into the NCAA tournament in 2022. But just with a ton of new faces here in the roster, very little experience, one of the youngest rosters in all college basketball, I predict that Auburn will go from 2nd to 10th this season in the SEC. Now move on to number 9 for my SEC predictions. Happens to be the Missouri Tigers for this season. So Missouri happens to be my sleeper, by the way, this season, the SEC. The Tigers only lost one player in the offseason when their number 8 scorer, Reed Nico, graduating from the program. Losing their 6'10" forward Nico, though, the graduation came at a cost as Missouri's roster is quite undersized. Also, the roster here for this season for Missouri, it is filled with upperclassmen and experience, with 5 seniors and 4 juniors on the roster. Missouri will for sure have that experience, but the big question is whether if they can win some more games. Missouri has posted back-to-back 15-win seasons. This season, the Tigers will return 7 players that started at least 11 games, and all these players averaged 18 minutes per game last season. The top 3 scorers they have for that will have the opportunity this season to keep on improving, they'll be back here for Missouri with Drew Smith, Xavier Pinson, and Mark Smith. And I expect all 3 of these players to be able to improve and take the steps up as well. And all 3 of these players averaged over 10 points per game last season. At Ford, looking to improve and stand out as the team's leading rebounder, happen to be 2 6'10" seniors with Mitchell Smith and Jeremiah Tillman. Another Ford coming in with sophomore Kobe Brown back to the program and started 26 games as a freshman for Missouri. So I'm not basing my prediction off this prediction here on Missouri's ceiling, which I feel like it's much higher than this with all the experience that they retain back on the roster. Big question mark, of course, if they can win some more games, but if these players in the roster can improve, then Missouri could possibly land an NCAA tournament bid. This team retained just so many pieces in the offseason. We'll just see now if they can put it together on the court and take the steps up. Missouri last season finished 11th in the conference. I predict that they're going to finish 9th this season in the SEC. Now move on to number 8 for my SEC predictions, as it happens to be the Ole Miss Rebels. So I predict that Ole Miss will not make the NCAA tournament, but I predict that they're going to be a bubble team this season. The rest of the teams above Ole Miss, I predict that will not make the NCAA tournament either. So after making the tournament back in 2019, Ole Miss trended downwards this past season. They finished with a record of 15-17 overall. The 2020 offseason resulted in 2 departures from the roster for Ole Miss, which was also a great transfer pickup they got as well to offset one of the roster departures. But we'll take a look at a big departure first. That happened to be the leading scorer, Breein Tyree, who averaged just under 20 points per game last season as he graduated from the program. Massive loss for Ole Miss. The second starter that left happened to be guard Blake Hinson, who transferred to Iowa State. As far as the solid transfer pickup, head coach Kermit Davis added in a 3-year starter grad transfer at Ford, the big man Romello White from Arizona State, who averaged 10.2 points per game last season and was the leading rebounder for the Sun Devils, tallying just under 9 rebounds per game. White's going to be able to come right in, be a part of the starting lineup, and give Ole Miss a much-needed boost inside. He shot the ball over 60% from the floor during his last 3 seasons for the Sun Devils. A second transfer joining Ole Miss this season happens to be junior guard Jarkel Joyner. Joyner sat out last season due to transfer rules, but he averaged 15.6 points per game during the 2018-19 season for Cal State Bakersfield. Now for the starters back for Ole Miss. The Rebels will return 2 solid rebounding forwards coming back with KJ Buffin and Kadeem Sy. Both Buffin and Sy averaged 5.5 rebounds per game last season, as Sy and Buffin will be joined by the big monsters rebounding force presence of Romello White. As for the player to watch out this season for Ole Miss, that player would have to be senior guard Devontae Shuler, who is second on the team in scoring last season. I expect Shuler to improve and lead the Rebels this season. Ole Miss will have 4 players in their roster to average more than 5 rebounds per game last season. And I predict that this team's going to be tough, gritty, good rebounding team. The main problem, though, that they're going to try to see if they can be able to cut into, though, is replacing leading scorer Breein Tyree. That's going to be the most challenging task here this season for Ole Miss. That's why I predict that Ole Miss will just miss the NCAA tournament, and I predict that they're going to finish at number 8 this season in the SEC. Now move on to number 7, as my prediction goes out to the South Carolina Gamecocks to finish at the halfway point here, number 7 in the conference. As I predict South Carolina to be on the NCAA tournament bubble, but I predict that South Carolina will make it in to the NCAA tournament. I predict that they're going to be a top 45 team, and they'll be one of 7 bids this season that the SEC receives into the 2021 NCAA tournament. So last season, South Carolina finished with a record of 18-13. They were on the outside of the NCAA tournament bracket when the season ended. This season, I expect the Gamecocks to land up on the right side of the bubble and take one of the last remaining NCAA tournament spots. In the offseason, South Carolina lost its leading rebounder, number 3 scorer Mike Kotsar, to graduation. Also, South Carolina lost a second starter with its number 4 scorer, Jair Bolden, who transferred out to Butler. As for this season's roster, head coach Frank Martin will bring back 5 players that started at least 12 games last season. The main player to watch out for will be junior guard A.J. Lawson, who withdrew from the NBA draft, and he was the leading scorer this past season for South Carolina. He's the player that can give the Gamecocks a legitimate shot at the NCAA tournament, with Lawson being back for South Carolina. The second starter back for the Gamecocks will be junior guard and number 2 scorer Jermaine Couisnard. He'll be back as well, as he averaged over 12 points per game last season. Starting for is Keyshawn Bryant, and Justin Minaya will also be back, as Minaya was second on South Carolina in rebounds per game last season, averaging 6 rebounds per game. The Gamecocks will also be bringing in a sit-out transfer guard with 7th Woods from North Carolina, as he was a bench player during his 3 seasons for the Tar Heels. This season, I predict that South Carolina will keep on improving, should be able to get them right to an NCAA tournament bid, and I've got them 7th in the SEC. Now I'll move on to number 6 here in the conference. That's where I predict it's going to be the Florida Gators for my prediction here. I predict that Florida is going to be a top 35 team this season. Last season, the Gators underachieved. They ranked at number 6 in the nation, the preseason top 25 poll. They landed one of the most sought-out transfers in all college basketball with Kerry Blackshear Jr., but they were unfortunately instead not a part of the top 25, as they fell out of the top 25 and were a part of the bubble conversation all season long. This season, I predict that Florida once again will be on the bubble, but they'll be able to make it into the tournament. In the offseason, head coach Mike White lost its top two starters with their senior big man. Kerry Blackshear Jr., the graduation, also lost point guard Andrew Nembhard to transfer over to Gonzaga. These 2 players were impact players last season on the roster. They were the number 2 and number 3 scorers on last season's team. Blackshear led the Gators last season in rebounds per game, averaging 7.5 rebounds per game. But as for this season's roster, junior forward, All-SEC first-team selection, Keontae Johnson will be back. He has the chance to take home the SEC Player of the Year. He had a great season last season. He averaged 14 points per game and just over 7 rebounds per game, and I predict he's going to have a massive season for the Gators. Also heading back to Florida will be 2 guards with Noah Locke and Scotty Lewis. Locke averaged over 10 points per game last season, while Scotty Lewis was a top 10 ranked recruit out of high school in the class of 2019, but Scotty Lewis did not have a big freshman season, so he has come back to Florida here to see if he can improve here, and I predict that Scotty Lewis is going to make some really great improvement here during year 2 for him playing for Florida. As for the other players here returning back to the Gators, that I predict that should be able to improve as well. These include sophomores Trey Mann, Quaze Glover, and Omar Payne, as Mike White will also be bringing in 2 transfers that sat out last season due to transfer rules, with forward Anthony DeRuggi and Tyree Appleby. DeRuggi started all 33 games for Louisiana Tech during the 2018-19 season, and Appleby averaged over 17 points per game at Cleveland State. back in the 2018-19 season. But for Florida, they had those two big offseason losses with their big man Kerry Blackshear Jr. to graduation, Andrew Nemhard at point guard, leaving Florida to transfer over to Gonzaga. I expect Keontae Johnson to carry the Gators, have a massive season, but as far as Scotty Lewis, I think he should be much improved as well, and I predict that Florida will finish 6th in the SEC this season. I believe that they're going to be an NCAA tournament team. I like them at number 6 in the conference. Now move on to number 5. That's where I predict the Arkansas Razorbacks here. Number 5, I predict that Arkansas will be a top 35 team this season and will make the NCAA tournament. The Razorbacks will have a new look starting 5 with only one starter returning back to the team. In the offseason, Arkansas lost the top 3 scorers, 2 of which went to the NBA draft. Guard Mason Jones, who averaged over 22 points per game, went to the NBA draft along with guard Isaiah Joe, who happened to be a late NBA draft declaration. Guard Jimmy Witt graduated from the program. Arkansas, I predict here that they're going to have a difficult task trying to replace that scoring production, that guard trio there. Jones, Joe, and Witt, as all 3 of these players averaged at least 14 points per game last season. Also, starting forward Adrio Bailey, he also graduated from the program, and also bench player Jalen Harris transferred over to Georgetown. The only player heading back to the starting lineup this season will be guard Desea Stills, who averaged over 10 points per game in his second season. The Razorbacks, they are ranked in the top half of the conference. This is due to the transfers that head coach Eric Musselman brought in during the offseason, winning in the offseason when it came to transfers, and that is what Eric Musselman did for Arkansas, as he'll be bringing in guards Justin Smith and J.D. Notae, and forwards Vance Jackson and Jalen Tate. We'll start off with Justin Smith. Smith started all 32 games last season for Indiana. He averaged over 10 points per game and 5.2 rebounds per game, and he's going to be an impact starting player here this season for Arkansas. The second player happens to be Vance Jackson, as he was a top 80 recruit out of high school. He played his first season at UConn, but then transferred over to New Mexico, where he averaged over 11 points per game last season. Then guard J.D. Notae, as for Notae, he averaged 15.5 points per game during his 2 seasons playing at Jacksonville. And then the fourth transfer coming in happens to be Jalen Tate, who's going to be able to help out the Razorbacks defensively this season, as Tate was tied for first in the Horizon League this past season with just under 2 steals per game, and he averaged just under 14 points per game last season for Northern Kentucky. As for the additional impact players for Arkansas, Musselman will bring in a top 10 recruiting class this season, led by 4-star shooting guard Moses Moody, who is a great opportunity to be a starting lineup spot as well here from Moody to be a part of the starting 5. The Razorbacks will also be bringing in 3 additional 4-star recruits, with point guard K.K. Robinson, shooting guard Devontae Davis, and center Jalen Williams. All in all season transfers here saved the Razorbacks this season. If Isaiah Joe had returned back to Arkansas, I predict that the Razorbacks would have been a top 25 team. Instead, I predict that they're going to be a top 35 team instead this season. They'll finish 5th in the SEC. Now I'll move on to number 4 here for my prediction for the SEC this season, and it happens to be the Alabama Crimson Tide. I predict that Alabama will be a top 30 team this season and will make the NCAA tournament. Year 2 under head coach Nate Oates, and this season should be able to translate into a much better season defensively, as well as cutting down the turnovers offensively as well. Last season, Alabama ranked 336th in the nation when it came to points allowed. They allowed 79 points per game. The Crimson Tide's offense, however, it was electric, averaging 82 points per game, which ranked number 3 in all college basketball. Alabama will bring back 4 out of their 5 starters from last season. The only player to depart from the starting lineup in the offseason happened to be their leading scorer, Kyra Lewis Jr., who went to the NBA draft. Last season's number 2 and 3 scorers with guards Jaden Shackelford and John Petty Jr. will be back. Both of these players averaged over 14 points per game last season. Also, seniors Alex Reese and Herb Jones will both return at forward. Both Reese and Jones started 26 games last season for the Crimson Tide to help out boost Alabama's defense for this season. Nate Oates was able to acquire a grad transfer, Jordan Bruner, at Ford from Yale, who nearly averaged a double-double of 10.9 points per game and 9.2 rebounds per game last season for the Yale Bulldogs. And Bruner was also named as a first-team All-Ivy League selection. A second transfer will be coming into Alabama with guard Javon Quinterly, who sat out last season but played his freshman season at Villanova. And Quinterly was a top 30 recruit out of high school but struggled to gain playing time while playing at Villanova and transferred out to Alabama. This season, I expect Alabama to keep on improving and move up towards the top of the SEC in the second season under head coach Nate Oates. Watch out for Alabama to be a top 5 offense once again this season. I predict that John Petty Jr. and Jaden Shackelford will carry this team as they will make the NCAA tournament. I've got the Crimson Tide at number 4 in the SEC. Now move on to number 3 here for my prediction for the SEC this season, and it happens to be the LSU Tigers. I predict that LSU will make the NCAA tournament, and they will be a top 25 team. So LSU benefited tremendously in the offseason with the decisions of their number 2, 4, and 5 scorers from last season, with a starting trio of Trendon Wofford, Javonte Smart, and Darius Days to all withdraw from the NBA draft. In the offseason, LSU lost their top scorer, Skylar Mays, to graduation. The Tigers also lost their number 3 scorer, Emmett Williams, who went over to the NBA draft. Sophomore forward Trendon Wofford, he's going to look to build off his spectacular freshman season as he averaged over 13 points per game and over 7 rebounds per game last season as a freshman. I predict that Trendon Wofford is going to have another stellar season. I predict that he's going to be a first-team All-SEC selection this season for LSU. Another player that's going to be back for the Tigers will be senior guard Charles Manning Jr., who should be able to see an uptick in minutes after starting 3 games last season. Also on the roster, another player here will be a transfer from Georgetown with Josh LeBlanc, who started 22 games as a freshman for the Hoyas, but happened to leave Georgetown during the beginning of his sophomore season. Overall, the big trio here, Watford, Smart, and Days, getting these 3 players back to withdraw from the NBA draft to Baton Rouge, that was huge here for LSU, and I predict the Tigers will finish 3rd in the SEC this season. Now we're down to 2. My team that I predict at number 2 here in the SEC this season happens to be the Tennessee Volunteers. I predict that Tennessee will be an NCAA tournament team, and I predict that they will be a top 12 team this season in all college basketball. Tennessee should be right back into that top 25 after last season's rebuilds, losing Grant Williams and Admiral Schofield the season prior to graduation. As Tennessee finished last season with a record of 17-14. 4 of Tennessee's 5 starters from last season will be back, with John Fulkerson, Yves Pons, Josiah Jordan-James, and Santiago Vescovi all heading back to Knoxville. The 2 impact players they expect to lead the Vols this season will be the 2 seniors with Fulkerson and Pons. John Fulkerson finished out last season the high note. He had a career-high 27 points in early March against Kentucky, while Yves Pons led the SEC last season in blocks per game. Tennessee will also be bringing in a freshman recruiting class currently ranked nationally in the top 5. The Vols will add in 2 freshman 5-star guards with Jaden Springer and Keon Johnson, along with 4-star power forward Corey Walker. Head coach Rick Barnes was able to bring in a key transfer as well from the Oregon Ducks with guard Victor Bailey Jr. Bailey started 8 games during his second season for Oregon 2 seasons ago. He connected on just under 40% of his 3-point shots from the perimeter. Tennessee will also get some more transfer help from the bench with grad transfer forward E.J. Inoseki, who averaged a double-double last season for Sacred Heart. He started all 33 games for the Pioneers. Head coach Rick Barnes, he has a lot to look forward to this season here for Tennessee, as I predict that this team's going to have a deep roster from top to bottom. I expect Tennessee to improve a ton from last season, and I predict that the Vols will finish 2nd in the conference this season in the SEC. And that leaves one team here, my SEC champion. I predict for this season, it happens to be the Kentucky Wildcats for Big Blue Nation. I predict that Kentucky will be an NCAA tournament team as a top 8 team this season. In the offseason, Coach Cal acquired one of the top transfers in all college basketball with 7-foot center for Wake Forest, Olivier Sarr. as Sarr was granted a waiver and he is eligible this season for Kentucky. That happens to be massive news as the Wildcats were looking and they were in desperate need of a center this season for their roster. Absolute gem they got here with Sarr. As for the newcomers for Kentucky, there's a bunch of them, as the Wildcats will be bringing in the #1 ranked recruiting class in all college basketball with 6 top 100 recruits. Coach Cal will be adding in 2 top 10 recruits here with small forwards, B.J. Boston and Terrence Clark. Also, Kentucky will be getting a point guard with Devin Askew, power forwards Isaiah Jackson and Lance Ware, and also a small forward with Cameron Fletcher. Also, a grad transfer coming along to Kentucky this season with Davion Mintz from Creighton. He averaged just under 10 points per game for the Blue Jays, and he's going to look to bring his power conference basketball experience to the roster at point guard. The only returning player from last season's squad happens to be Keon Brooks Jr., who will look to take a big step up this season in year 2, as Keon Brooks averaged 4.5 points per game his freshman season. It's going to be a bunch of new faces this season for Kentucky. It means the possibility of potential NBA draft prospects all over the board for the 2021 NBA draft. I think it's going to be close with the top 2 teams in the conference between Kentucky and Tennessee this season, but I've got Kentucky winning this season's SEC crown, and that's where I have Kentucky winning the SEC title at #1. So that's a wrap here to this video, my Southeastern Conference college basketball rankings for the 2020-21 college basketball season. Make sure to like, share, comment, subscribe to my channel. Also, ring the notification bell if you'd like to be notified about future live content as well from my play-by-play live streams. Feel free to check out my college basketball preseason top 25 video as well, and all the other great content that I have going on Behind the Arc Basketball. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, as this is Behind the Arc Basketball.